My name is Hessa Shouehi. I'm the head of communications and public diplomacy here at the UAE Embassy. I want to start with a few thanks word to our partner at YPFP. We're really excited. We've collaborated before in many projects, and we look forward upcoming collaboration. Please allow me to introduce Sunil John, the president of the Middle East and North Africa BCW and the founder of ASDA. Sunil is both the brains and the heart behind the Arab Youth Survey. Normally, Sunil would do this presentation from Dubai, but I guess we're lucky today to have him here in person in the same room. Before just starting the presentation, Sunil, if you would allow me to share a few observations. I had the chance to view the results, and I think the title of this year's survey, Hope for the Future, it paints a positive and more optimistic future of the region. You may know that the Arab or the Middle East region went through a lot of challenges, and not only the Arab region, the whole world, I guess. But the results for this year came out very surprising, and Sunil will be able to talk more about this in his presentation. This brings me to my second point. For 10 years in a row, the UAE came out, or the Arab youth named the UAE as the country they would most like to live in and wish their country would emulate. So this is something we're really proud of. And please allow me to, if you're asking why, Ambassador Atiba said, there's indeed a hopeful way forward. A model of coexistent educational and economic opportunity exists to close to home for Arab youth. As of last week, we celebrated the UAE's first Golden Jubilee. And our story, I think, by itself is a story of hope. I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and I would like to introduce Aubrey. So floor is yours, Aubrey.
Thank you, Hessa. And first, I just want to thank the embassy for having us. This is in this beautiful ballroom. It's such a pleasure to be together in person again, and to also be able to benefit from having our audience join virtually. It's kind of the best of both worlds. The UAE Embassy has been one of YPFP's long and most influential partnerships. We have really appreciated the support for many years and are really excited to learn about the Arab Youth Survey. It's so aligned with the interests of our members, whether it is the Middle East discussion group that we have within YPFP, or the upcoming cultural diplomacy exchange or the study tour that we do in partnership with the UAE Embassy. We'll be sending a delegation of YPFP members abroad to the UAE to immerse themselves in the culture and learn about life and diplomacy abroad, and specifically in the UAE and the Middle East. So we couldn't thank the embassy and the UAE and the ambassador enough for their ongoing support and partnership in the work that we do. And really thank you to both of the presenters. We're really excited to hear all of your work and your findings. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping rules or items, I guess. For those who are attending virtually, please stay on mute, and we'd love to have your cameras on. We like to see your faces. It makes you feel like you're in the room with us. And we will allot a lot of time for question and answers for both people in the room and online. So for those who are joining us virtually, if you'd like to ask a question, please put your name in the chat function of the Zoom. What we'll do is I'll call you by order of the names, and you'll be able to come off mute with your camera on and ask the questions directly. That way you get to engage with the speakers, but there's some kind of order and some kind of, it functions a bit more smoothly. Otherwise, I am delighted to be here, and we'll turn the mic over to our presenters to hear about the work that they've been doing.
Thank you, Hessa, and thank you, Aubrey, for those kind introductions. Indeed, this is not my first engagement, our first engagement with YPFP. I think we had a session last year as well, and I'm glad there's so much interest from all of you having come here in person, as well as people who joined us virtually. For quick introductions, as Hessa said, I'm Sunil John, and I'm the president for the Middle East and North Africa for BCW, which is one of the top 3 global PR communications firms. The Arab Youth Survey has been personally my passion project for 13 years. 13 years is a long time, and to kind of persevere with that work and bring those data and insights out there into the field takes some effort, and unless it's driven by passion, it doesn't happen. And the passion comes with the need to be able to share data with policymakers in government, with businesses, so that they can use that for making the right policies. Because the reason why we do this is the Arab world, as all of you know, is the youngest demographic in the world. 60% of the population below the age of 30. There's no other place in the world as young as that. And that's 200 million youth. So if you want to understand the Arab world, you need to understand the hearts and minds of these young people, these young men and women who are really the future of this very important part of the world. And that's why we do this, and that's why we bring these results day in and day every year, so that people like all of you can benefit as well. One thing I need to tell you is that we do this study by using our own resources. We do not take any sponsorship money, just to ensure its credibility with organizations and groups such as you, and PSB, which is the polling firm that is part of the BCW group, and my colleague here, Michael Hodgkinson, does a great job in being able to go out to these 17 Arab countries that form the universe of this study and talk to young people in the age group of 18 to 24. We take a great amount of trouble to make sure that what we get is credible information and it's reliable information. And that's why we do what's called face-to-face interviews. It's not online, because the reliability of face-to-face, especially in the Arab world, is critical to ensure that the data and insights we bring are usable and reliable. So that's what we do. I think we have we launched the 13th annual survey on October the 12th. You can see all those findings on our website, arabyouthsurvey.com. And we do that because we put that out in a public domain for free access for governments, for businesses, for civil society, for academics, for organizations such as yours, because you can benefit from what's out there. So you have the full findings. What we bring for you today are some findings which we think are relevant for you and the work that you do, and to spark off some questions in our Q&A session. So it's not, you'll find more data on our survey, on our website, all the way from 2008 to 2013. Do spend some time there, and you can see the importance of tracking data, because it shows what's changing on the ground in the Arab world. Okay, so Hessa has already talked about hope for the future, which is our theme. And if we go forward, I think I'm going to skip. Okay, I'm sorry. I think I might have to fall back on your assistance, Aubrey, to move the slides forward.
I think he's loading it up.
Okay. So before, maybe Michael, you can add a few things on the methodology if I missed something.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Sunil. Thank you, Hessa, and thank you, Aubrey. Thank you for being here. So very quickly, the methodology, and we haven't got much time today. So this year we interviewed 3,400 young Arabs across the Middle East region. So when we talk about young Arabs in the survey, we mean 18 to 24-year-olds. We've been doing this for 13 years. I mean, almost, I think, 40,000 odd interviews that have taken place over that time, which I do quite like thinking about. It's almost someone who took the survey back in 2008 in our first iteration would almost now be 40, which really speaks to the fact this is quite a cross-generational study at this point. Our sample is 50-50, male and female, and we conduct our interviews in June, throughout June of this year. Next slide. What the next slide will show when it comes up is that we broadly look at 3 key regions. So the first is the GCC, and we conduct interviews in 5 countries in the GCC. The next is Levant and others, which is amongst Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, Syria, as well as Yemen, and North Africa, Algeria, Egypt, Libya, Morocco, Sudan, Tunisia. So a really kind of full sample of the kind of largest and most important countries across the MENA region. And then lastly, cities. So as Sunil mentioned, we do this interviews face-to-face, and as part of that, we always try to select a set of cities, large towns, territories that really encompass the diversity that comes with each of these countries in the Middle East and North Africa region. So as you see, we do interviews in different cities. In the UAE, it's Dubai, Sharjah, and Abu Dhabi. And right across those slides, you get a reflection of the different places where we conduct those face-to-face interviews in June of this year.
So on to our first finding, and as Hessa said, despite a very difficult period, the pandemic, the high levels of unemployment, youth unemployment, as all of you know, is the highest in the world, in the Arab world, nearly 30%. And despite all that, and despite continuing conflicts in some parts of the Arab world, the outlook has been so positive. And that's what the results say here, that when you look at the last 5 years, it's actually been, it's 60% of the sample across the 17 countries say their best days lie ahead. It's a 10% increase from 2020. In 2020, we did the survey much before the pandemic hit, in January, February, actually. So you're looking at a 10% increase on that positive outlook is actually a fabulous result. When you really look at it, it is what I call the exuberance of youth. When you asked 18 to 24-year-olds, what's your future look like? And they're going to say the best days are ahead. And that's great that despite the difficulty, they keep a positive outlook. And this is how the breakup looks like when you look at optimism across the Middle East, North Africa. Kuwait is the highest, almost the same. The UAE is again at 90% positive in terms of them feeling the best days ahead. Saudi Arabia, 82%, Oman, 78%. And of course, you will see, despite difficulties in countries like Iraq and Yemen and Palestine, the optimism is at near 50%. Obviously, in countries like Lebanon and Syria, it's much lower simply because of the issues those countries had. When you look at, when we ask the question, what do you think? Is your economy in your country going in the right direction? And here we are just capturing right direction data. And when you look at the last 5 years, it's moved from 52 to 53 in 2018. 2020 it dipped to 43, and it's moved up in 2021, despite the issues around the pandemic and other economic issues. So we see that cutting across both their view on their best days lie ahead, and the economy is going in the right direction. Here is when we ask the question, when do you think the countries, the economies will recover? A majority of them, as you can see, have said first half of 2022, and that's across the board, especially when you look at GCC, 31% said first half of 2022, second half of 2022. So roughly that's where they see the recovery. We don't know where the new variant is going. In 2 weeks, we'll know how it impacts. But I think clearly 2022 looks like where things will come back to a certain amount of normalcy. Having said that, while there is a positive outlook, when we ask young people in the Arab world, what are the obstacles facing their progress? And here's where you see young people having a very realistic view, a very pragmatic view of what is stopping them. And here you see rising cost of living, or what are called kitchen table issues, predominantly preoccupying their minds of what's stopping progress. And when you really look at the numbers, you see rising cost of living. 89% said that's creating those obstacles in progress. COVID-19 pandemic, obviously, 88%. Quality of education. People, especially with lack of in-person learning, has impacted the quality of education. 87 people of the sample say that's an obstacle. 84% feel unemployment. As all of you know, youth unemployment nearly at 30% is a record high. So that's what we call kitchen table issues. It's the here and now. That's what occupies their minds. And of course, there are other issues, more political, such as the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, corruption, or the role of what is called wasta in the Arab world. online data, privacy, safety and privacy, income inequality. Those are the other issues, including personal debt. And here is the question, what the cost of living, which is the predominant obstacle. Look at how it was high in 2020, almost the same levels at 89%, which is a big concern for young people. And here's about how they describe their personal finances. 37% feel that they struggle to pay their expenses in full, which means that that split between GCC, North Africa, and Levant. You know, when you spend some time on the website, you will see we kind of put the data in three groups. The GCC, as Michael said, North Africa and Levant, three very distinct regions, and there are some commonalities. But look at how disparate the numbers are. 56% in the Levant, for obvious reasons, find it difficult to make the both ends meet. North Africa at 37%, but the Gulf much lesser at 13%. That's the second finding. The third, we think, which was important for you to consider, is the question of identity. When you ask a young Arab, what is it that defines you? Is it religion? Is it nationality? Is it language? You know, and what comes out is that religion is still central to their identity, while over 2/3 of them are looking at reforms of religious institutions. It's a very interesting finding. Here you can see last year in 2020, nearly 40% of the sample said, my religion defined me, but look at the drop, nearly 34%. My family, my tribe, 21% this year. My nationality, 18%. My Arabic heritage, nearly 10%. And this is a changing scenario. My language, only 5%, you know. We've seen that kind of with concern that most of the young people do not use the Arabic language, much more in terms of English, and that's a big loss if that trend continues. My gender, about 5%. And when you look at what defines what is most important for personal identity, and this is just religion, you can see countries like Sudan, you know, religion, 61% of the Sudanese youth feel religion defines them, versus Jordan and Algeria at over 50%. And then you have a range of countries from Iraq, Yemen, but interestingly, the UAE has only 16% actually say their religion defines them. You can see a much bigger role as my nationality that defines UAE youth. So you can see how different that identity question is. We've been looking at this for many years, and we're seeing this a big change in how young people define their identity. Here's 2/3 of the Arab youth say that they want religious institutions to reform, and see how that number, in 2019, when we first introduced the question, 79% said, and that said that they want religious institutions to be more modernized, linking with their values that they live with today. And that number almost is consistent across the 3 years, more so. And you can see pretty much unanimity in GCC, North Africa, and Levant on that question. So an interesting aspect to look at for policymakers. And in terms of religious institutional reforms, you can see the country breakups here from Oman, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, all the way to Sudan, Egypt, Algeria, and Tunisia. You can see the top 10 countries are over 70%. So you can see a number of countries. At the bottom of the pile, of course, Bahrain, only 44% say that they want religious institutions to reform. But anywhere, anything above 50% is a huge relevant finding for policymakers to listen to the voice of the Arab youth in terms of what they're asking for. Fourth, I think His Excellency Yusuf Al-Otaiba's favorite finding, Hessa, if you agree. Model nations, this is something we introduced the question 10 years ago, and not surprisingly, the UAE stands out as the country that most Arab youth want to live in and for their own countries to emulate. And you would know that when we put that finding out there and the question out there, we give them nearly 30 countries to choose from. And these are developed countries and developing countries in the region, in the West and in Asia. And that's where the pecking order is. UAE, by far, the most predominant choice of 47% who said that that's the country they want to live in. United States come next at 19, less than half. Canada at 15, France at 13%, and Germany at 11. And when you see the findings of that consistently over the last 10 years, and I would think, the UAE celebrating its 50th anniversary this year, its golden jubilee. I think this finding in some ways is a validation of the policies that UAE follows in terms of listening to the voice of the youth and creating a much more diversified, tolerant society that makes UAE stand out across in the Middle East for sure. Here's some data that we haven't announced before, which is which country do we like to live in? And the people that chose UAE, these are the countries that chose them, from Sudan to Egypt to Iraq. 56% of Saudi youth want to live in the UAE. It's an interesting finding. And then across the board with Yemen, Oman, and Kuwait on the bottom of that list. The second question we asked is, which country in the world would you like your own country to emulate? And UAE again stands up as the number one choice. For me, who has lived in the UAE for nearly 25 years, this choice is not surprising because you can see the policies that the UAE government follows. I think some of you would be visiting the UAE and you will see what a wonderful, tolerant society that the UAE leadership has been able to build. Of course, followed by the United States, Canada, Germany, and France. When we ask them, why do you choose the UAE? What's the reason? And here again, the top reason being a growing economy, a wide range of work opportunities, clean and enjoyable environment being among the top choices, safe and secure. So those are the reasons why people chose the UAE as a model nation. Over to you, Michael, on foreign relations.
Thank you, Sunil. So something we've seen over the last few years and something we've asked about is about allies and enemies. So where do Arab youth see as their key allies and who's their key enemies? And something that's come out this year is, and consistent with previous years, is the focus on 3 Arab countries. So Egypt, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia. On the right-hand side there, you see the proportion of young Arabs saying that each of these countries is an ally of their own country. Egypt, 85% see as an ally. UAE slightly behind at 83%. Saudi Arabia, 80%. Always interesting, and perhaps interesting for this audience, is that China is the top non-Arab country in terms of ally, 79%, followed by Russia, and almost right down the bottom there is the United States at 57%, Iran at 33%, and Israel, perhaps unsurprisingly, at 11%. Now, how's that changed over the last 5 years? So what we've shown here is those top 3 Arab states, Egypt, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia, and the United States, and looked at the tracking data for the proportion of young Arabs seeing these countries as allies. Firstly, Egypt started off in 74% in that green bar in 2017, has increased relatively steadily ever since, up to about 85% this year. In the case of the UAE, it was 79% in 2017, has again increased steadily up to about 83% this year, peaked at 93% in 2019. In the case of Saudi Arabia, again, a steady increase from 70% or so, 71% in 2017 to around 80%, around 4 in 5 young Arabs saying Saudi Arabia is an ally in 2021. And the US is a very different picture, a very different trajectory as such. So started off in 2017 at 46%. We saw the real impact of some of President Trump's policies coming through there in terms of a low of 35%. 1 in 3 young Arabs saw the US as an ally in 2018. And that's increased steadily since. We were expecting an increase, I think, between 2020 and 2021, with obviously the impact of President Biden's policies, but that doesn't seem to have happened. So it doesn't seem to be reflected in the views of young Arabs and whether they see the US as an ally. Worth noting that this data was collected before the pullout from Afghanistan, and I'm sure that would affect these numbers as well. But being an ally and enemy is quite different from being influential, and Arab youths understand this, they respect that. So looking at which countries they see as most influential on their region, it's still the United States that comes out top. So over half of young Arabs said the US is either the country with the most or the second most influence on their own country, followed by Saudi Arabia, 29%, the top Arab country, and the UAE at 23%. Next, Israel, and then some other countries as well. So we pointed out China earlier, but worth noting that despite the fact that young Arabs see China as an ally, actually very few see China as more influential, and that's despite the influence they've had through COVID, vaccines and other things in the last year or so. And lastly, just delving into which of those countries see the US as influential. So where is that influence being felt? And I think this really reflects some of the foreign policy that's been going on over the last couple of decades or so. So Iraq, top, 7 in 10 young Iraqis see the US as the most influential country in their own, followed by Kuwait, Algeria, so on and so forth. Right down the bottom there is the UAE, Libya, and Oman. Climate change, the hot button issue of the moment. So what we've seen, and actually I think one of the things we always talk about with this is the issue of kitchen table issues. Sunil talked about that earlier. But actually, despite the fact that there are lots of very important issues for young Arabs, they are willing to take action on climate change and expect their governments to lead on this key issue. So over half of young Arabs, 56%, said they'd be willing to boycott a brand they knew was damaging the environment. They were willing to take actual action when it came to the choices they were making in their products. And one thing that's very important about this is it's consistent. So this isn't something focused on a particular region, but actually across different countries, across different regions, young Arabs were willing to boycott brands that were seen as damaging the environment. And concern is high. So it's perhaps not as high as issues, kitchen table issues like rising cost of living, like unemployment, but actually well over half of young Arabs are saying they are concerned by the issue of climate change. This has increased quite significantly since back in 2008 when we first did the study, where very few were seeing the issue of the environment as a key one. Now it's really at the top of many people's minds, and as we saw, they were willing to take action on it. And this is a key issue, again, across the 3 regions, so across the GCC, North Africa, and the Levant. And then lastly, and I think something that's worth thinking about when we talk about COP and when we talk about these actions of governments. And if you look at the newspapers now, there's a lot of discussion over what role developing countries versus developed countries should take in combating climate change. What's clear is that Arab youth expect their governments to lead on this issue. That could be the GCC, it could be North Africa, it could be the Levant, but 43% believe that Arab countries should be doing more than other countries, should be taking a lead on the issue when it comes to climate change, and less, slightly over half, believe that they should be having the same amount, or around 1 in 5, 20% at the top left, said that Arab countries should be doing less. So generally speaking, young Arabs expect their countries to lead on this absolutely key issue. And then lastly is confidence. Do young Arabs feel confident in their government to deal with this issue? And they're split on it. So 48%, just under half, say they are confident in their government's ability to deal with climate change. 50% say they're not. It is something that we see as quite different by region, though, and perhaps that reflects the resources in some places over others. So 79% of young Arabs in the GCC said they have confidence in their government's ability to deal with climate change. That is significantly less than half in North Africa and the Levant. And part of that might be down to how they see climate change as being dealt with. So what we asked here was a question around whether youth see climate change as being dealt by technological advancements, by the new inventions, the new technology we see every year at the moment, or whether by people changing their lives, changing their behavior, actually having to change the way they live them in order to combat climate change. And if you look at the left, the 4 countries that are most likely to see technology as a solution to climate change are all in the GCC. So Kuwait, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Bahrain. So I think really speaking to the impact of technology in those countries and their confidence in government, but perhaps something to overcome in terms of a public policy challenge and getting youth in those countries to change their behavior in the face of climate change. Thank you very much.
So
Sunil?
Just a quick roundup of what we presented to you today. I think outlook, really a positive outlook in terms of the future. Young people feel their best days are ahead of them, which is brilliant. But yet they know the obstacles that are kind of stymieing their progress. and the focus on kitchen table issues. When we asked in the early days what was their biggest issues that stopped them, they said living in a democracy until the Arab Spring happened, actually. So if you go back, it's an interesting trend to see how people were at that period of time very revolutionary in their outlook, and much more now today they're focusing on kitchen table issues. Let me get a job. Let me start a family. Let me get good education so I get I'm in better position for the jobs of the future. Those are the things that young people are concerned about. So a very pragmatic view in terms of how they want to move ahead in life. The third thing is the question of identity. I think this is where the scene is changing dramatically. And I think much more we see, religion does play a role, but nationality is rising to the fore. That more young people feel that their nations describe them and describe their identity. We then talked about model nations, of how people see what is a good model to follow, and this is interesting because they see their own nation within their region as a model to follow. That despite UAE living in what is called a tough neighborhood, that the fact that they could make it happen and it becomes a model for other people to follow. Foreign relations, hugely changing scenario. The old spheres of influence is gone. More young Arabs are depending on their own to show the way forward, and that's where the rise of Egypt, UAE, and Saudi Arabia is significant to note, especially with all of you on foreign relations, which is your subject. And then I think climate change is an issue which will occupy us for the next decade and more. And I think this is an issue that Arab youth are fully concerned about. And the fact that they could vote with their wallets by saying 60% said they will boycott a brand that is seen to be damaging the environment is an extremely important issue. So that's what we have today for the group here, Hessa and Aubrey. And if you have any questions, we are more than willing to look at them. Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you for sharing that really interesting presentation that covered such a wide range of the daily life of Arab youth and how they walk through the world every day. Yes. First, I would love to open it to questions, both for the people in the room, but also for those joining virtually. If you're joining virtually, please type your name in the chat and I will ask you to come off mute and ask it directly. There's a chance that we might have an audio challenge, but we'll try and then we'll adjust and I can read your question aloud if it doesn't work. So first we have a question from Adriana online. Adriana, do you mind coming off mute and asking?
I do. Hi, everyone. So my question is can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Yeah. Perfect.
Okay. My question is regarding the boycotting of brands. What would that look like in practice? Because we know that a lot of people feel that way, but then when we think about the current needs of society and in relation also to the U.S. influence, who is not one to boycott brands due to climate concerns, how would that actually look for Arab youth, or what shape could that take?
I think in the past, there have been movements where general Arab community did boycott certain brands for political reasons. So there's a history of boycotts in the region, and it has happened in the past. This is an indication. The survey is just a barometer of where they are, the sense of what they are thinking about. So the fact that they feel that they have an activist role on this is very interesting to see. How will that pan out in actual behavior? Will they really vote with their wallets, saying, I'm not going to buy this brand because this brand is not working, or an institution, or in fact, even a government or a company? That's something to be seen. What we bring in the survey is what's happening on the ground. What's the sentiment? What's the perception? It could mean anything on the ground. I'm not able to say how is that going to pan out, but I can tell you there is a history of Arab communities boycotting brands, and I think it's very much possible that this could happen. I think it's a very positive sign, I think. Yeah.
And if you have a question in the room, go ahead and just raise your hand and I'll invite you to ask. And until then, the next question is from Maz.
Assalamu alaikum, can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. So I just wanted to ask for clarity or expansion on what you mean by Islamic institutions in the survey.
Religious institutions.
We actually, the question was very specific. Maybe, Michael, you want to take that?
Yeah, it related to Islamic institutions. Was that
It's religious institutions.
Yeah, the phrasing is religious institutions. We don't, and I can clarify with the exact translation of that, we don't tend to give specifics around these things, the idea being that it gives people the opportunity to define it themselves, because it needs to be in terms that they understand and they respond to, and we also don't want to bias the survey. So in that sense, we use that phrase, and we've used it for a few years without issue as such.
So if I could just follow up on that, I was hoping that was going to be your response. But in terms of just you as a survey writer, what are your assumptions that come to mind of what those institutions can be? Or do you guys totally veer away from defining that?
Like Michael said, we don't want to bias the respondents by naming institutions, but all we say is, do your religious institutions match with the values you live with today? And the answer is much more a capture of what they feel, and they feel that religious institutions don't match with those values and they need to reform. It's a delicate subject, as you would very much agree, and there's that much we can probe on that subject. Remember, we talk to young people, we take great amount of trouble to make sure that they feel comfortable about it. The question when we go and talk to people, let's say in malls or on streets, they say, who's asking the question? So, to do the survey, PSB take great amount of trouble to make sure that what we capture is the real sense of what is on the street. So there are certain things you cannot probe beyond, and I'm sure you understand as well, especially on a subject like religious institutions. So that's as much as we can really do in that area. But the fact that, a majority, 60% plus, want their religious institutions to reform is a great indicator of how people should be looking at what needs to change on the ground. And the fact that they feel that the role of religion in public life needs to be less. You should read the chapter on findings on identity and religion. It's an extremely important subject that all of you should study. What we bring is some thought-provoking insights for you to look into this. And we'll probe into that subject year on year, and we have tracking data. And what we can tell you, the scene is changing, for sure. I hope that's a satisfactory answer, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anna.
Hello. Thank you so much for your personal insights. We really appreciate this for our development and growth. And my question has to do exactly with identity. I guess I just kept wondering how, we mentioned that they feel like their religious identity and nationality, but how do we believe that we can increase also the language? So I think, the Arabic language is also very important to national identity. So how can we make it so, or not we, but how do we believe it's the best way that we can increase the influence of the Arabic language in the world? Thank you.
A very important question, and thank you for asking that. This is something, if you look at some of our past survey findings, we focused on this issue because language is a very big part of what identifies you. And we are seeing that only 5% of the sample say that my language identifies me, which I think is a very sad reading of what's happening on the ground. I think more and more young people are not focusing on preserving their Arabic language heritage, which is something we have said in the past. Many of the Arab governments are actually focusing on this. In fact, reading as a habit is very low. It is the lowest in the world, in the Arab world itself, and more young people, because there are not enough books. Arabic content on the internet is so low. So, you can see that, most social media, yes, there's Arabic content, but more and more people follow English content. And this is an indication for governments, for educational institutions, for civil society, for organizations to focus on making sure that the young do not defocus on their language. Very important issue, and thank you for asking that question. What we do here, as I say, we bring the survey and the findings, so it benefits policymakers. And I think this is something that governments and institutions and businesses should focus on.
Thank you. Any other questions there?
This one here.
Does it just work? Is it working?
Yeah, it's okay.
My question is regarding the allies and enemies part of the survey, which I find so interesting, and I had actually read before this event. With Israel being so low still, with only, I think it was 11% viewing them as an ally, have you seen any change in that trend after the Abraham Accord signing, whether just with the Emirates or other people who have signed on, or is that not a diplomatic change that's felt by Arab youth and just at the government level?
I think a very important question again. I think the Abraham Accord has been a game changer in the Arab world in terms of the fact that 4 countries, not just the UAE, but 3 other countries actually signed the Abraham Accord. And that we've seen a change on the ground, including all parts. Having said that, I think there has been a fair amount of disagreement or agreement with the Abraham Accord across the Arab world. But specifically in the UAE, you're looking at nearly 80% agreement that this is the right thing to do. And that's having an impact across especially the Gulf, including Saudi Arabia as well. So we are seeing a change. I think the Abraham Accord is an important milestone in foreign relations between the Arab world and Israel. And I think in many ways, we're going to watch that much more closely in the future surveys. But yes, thank you for pointing that out. Indeed, foreign relations is changing. Israel and the Abraham Accord is one aspect. And I can see that, that allies and enemies chart changing in the next 5 years fairly dramatically. But the bigger trend is the fact that Arab youth depend on their own as their allies and in terms of leading the foreign relations moving forward. So, and you can see, I think, in our view, that United States is stepping back in some ways has had an impact, and watch very closely how China and Russia is entering the scene in a big way. China is not seen as an influential power, but the fact that they look at foreign policy by being more economically ingrained in the Arab world is a policy which is very different from what the US says. So if you read our white paper, which you can download on our website, arabyouthsurvey.com, you can actually read a piece written by the famous author Kim Ghattas, where she writes about how the US-China rivalry is going to play out in the Middle East. Brilliant piece. And as all of you students of foreign policy, do read that piece, and Kim actually does explain that aspect very, very interestingly. I hope that was a good answer. Thank you.
Thank you. And another question from the virtual audience from Saud. If you can unmute yourself.
Hello, everyone. I hope you guys are doing fine. Thank you so much. My question is, how can the survey be effective, and how it actually can help when it comes to the youth role in the Abrahamic Accord? I'm specifically talking about cluster 6, people to people. Thank you.
Did you catch that question, Michael?
You're specifically asking about people to people, how it can impact the daily life of the youth in the Arab world. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Take the UAE, for instance. The traffic between Tel Aviv and Abu Dhabi and Dubai is huge. The number of kosher restaurants across the country is changed. The number of business deals happening between Israeli, especially technology companies and UAE companies, is at an unbelievable high. Similar with Bahrain. These two countries are actually changing how their accord converts, not only in business, but in people-to-people exchange. So you're seeing a dramatic, it's early days. It's only September 2020 that the Abraham Accord, the first Abraham Accord, was signed by UAE and Bahrain. And then I think this is something that, it works against the stereotype of decades of rivalry or enmity. And I think it takes time for change. And I think change is definitely happening, and change for good. But that actually sparks an important observation we have, is that the Arab world in general, if you look at the big theaters of war, whether it's Syria, whether it's Libya, whether it's Yemen, or whether it's Iraq, most of these conflicts are coming down. Most of them are actually finding peaceful ways to find resolutions. This is in some way a milestone or a pivot moment for the region to use this moment to actually focus on economic progress, on bringing more opportunities for young people. That's what young people want, opportunities. And how do you bring those opportunities? And my personal belief is they needed to focus on three key things. And those three key things are education, education, and education, because that's the foundation of the future. And that's where I think one of the findings we didn't talk about is the fact that 87% of the young people feel that education is an obstacle for their future progress. And if you teach them how to do it right, and you prepare them for the jobs of the future, I think all your problems are solved. So, that's where the core is, and that's where you need to be able to, bring the youth to build a more progressive Arab world. And I feel very confident that that's the right direction that governments are taking, and the youth is responding as well.
And perhaps adding to Saud's question, if I may, I hope I'm not stealing his question or changing it, but how do you hope the survey will influence policy or the daily life of Arab youth?
You spark an interesting thought in my mind. When we started the survey in 2008, the first 3 years, nobody even looked at our survey sideways, or some survey talks about things. But we did it because, to a great extent, we wanted to make sure that the voice of the Arab youth reach policymakers. But something happened, as all of you know, in 2011. And that's when our survey really got the attention of everyone, from governments to businesses to civil society, and that's the Arab Spring. And if you go back and read our white papers for 8, 9, and 10, you'll see the Arab Spring happening. And that's the value of data and insights. That, when you listen to the voice of the citizenry, you're able to make better policies. You'll be able to do the right things, and you build a much more progressive society. That's how I see. Our role is only to get that slice of life view presented to policymakers, and I congratulate the UAE embassy here, who's played a fantastic role to be able to bring all of you together so you can share the insights. Because what we do by doing this, we get more people to understand the Arab world. We build bridges of understanding. And I think I really compliment His Excellency, Mr. Yusuf Al Otaiba, for having arranged this meeting.
Thank you. And I'm looking at the time, and we have just a minute or two left. So Hessa, I would love to turn it over to you for some closing remarks. And first, thank you to both of you for this presentation. It's fascinating, and I can't wait to dig into the study more.
Thank you.
Thank you, Aubrey. So I think just would like to invite you, all of you, to take a chance if you're interested in learning more about the Arab youth. This survey really captures the hope and the wishes for the Arab youth. I called Sunil yesterday, and he was saying, like, for people in the West, they would look at the Middle East as one pool, when in reality they're very different. Yes, we do have a common language, and we do have a lot of commonalities, but we're different, and this is reflected in the survey. So take a look, and I think hopefully you will be also ambassadors of this survey and share it with a larger group. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for the audience who tuned in online, and hope to see you in future event. Thank you very much.
Thank you. If you all will join me in thanking our presenters.